Sabrınız için çok teşekkür ederim. İsmim Melda Çelen, Global Compact Türkiye'nin genel sekreteriyim. Hoş geldiniz ilk önce aramıza. Bugün hem Türkiye'nin hem de dünyanın birçok yerinden hem dinleyicilerimiz ve konuklarımız var aramızda. 2030 yılına kadar yaşamak istediğimiz dünyayı bize SDG'ler, sürdürülebilir kalkınma amaçları tanımladı. Bunlardan belki de en önemlisi 16. sürdürülebilir kalkınma amacı olan barış, adalet ve güçlü kurumlar. Bugün bu amaca iyi yönetişim ilkeleri çerçevesinden bakacağız ve kurumların iyi yönetişimle bu amaca nasıl hasıl olabileceklerini tartışmacılarımızla beraber konuşacağız. Sözü daha fazla uzatmak istemiyorum ve Demet Hanım, Global Compact Türkiye'nin başkan yardımcısı Demet İkiler'e sözü bırakmak istiyorum. Tekrardan hoş geldiniz.
Thank you, Melda. On behalf of the Executive Board, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the UN Global Compact Turkey event on good governance. I am Demet İkiler, WPP Turkey Country Chair and CEO of Group M in EMEA region. I'm also honored and proud to serve as the Vice President of United Nations Global Compact Turkey, where I lead the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Global Compact Turkey is one of the leading local networks. With its 68 signatories, it's the 8th largest network in Europe and 78th largest in the world. Dear participants, clearly we have many challenges before us in terms of sustainability, and the COVID-19 pandemic has made them more visible for everybody. As business leaders, we need to be well aware that the measure of performance of our institutions can not only be financial results, but also the positive contribution to the social and environmental issues within the framework of good governance principles. Promoting good governance is a multinational challenge. Good governance promotes accountability, transparency, efficiency, and the rule of law at all levels. Good governance also allows efficient management of human, natural, economic, and financial resources for equitable and sustainable development. Good governance guarantees civil society participation in decision-making processes. Good governance also is putting human welfare at the center of all decisions. To survive and thrive, every organization must master the art of balancing the needs of various stakeholders. The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed that the strongest companies and leaders are those that are purposeful and confident about their role in societies. The businesses that are exceeding expectations are winning because they prioritize understanding the needs of and creating value for all their stakeholders, including colleagues, consumers, communities, and the capital markets. Corporate governance leads us to humanized growth, which is a mindset, a way of working, recognizing human wellness as the center of decisions. The Institute for Real Growth, a not-for-profit and independent institute supported by WPP Group, refers to such leaders as Da Vinci growth leaders. Da Vinci was both left-brained and right-brained. He was whole-brained, both scientist and artist, and he was a humanist, celebrating humanity and its role in the natural environment. Da Vinci profile leaders have a holistic perspective of the environment we live in, the understanding of not just people, but also animals, the communities, and the markets. This is exactly what I mean when I say multi-stakeholder environment. At the micro level, holistic leaders and companies can enhance good governance by integrating corporate sustainability principles into their own operations and relationships, allowing for greater transparency, accountability, and inclusiveness. At the macro level, we can contribute to the development and implementation of international norms and standards, for instance, as part of a commitment to the UN Global Compact. Dear colleagues, good governance should be like air. Its existence needs to be discussed, but its absence would make a huge difference. I'm going to close with a quote from Rumi. Rumi was a Persian poet who lived on our soil during the 13th century, one of history's most cherished mystics. His poetry knows no equal. He says, "The flute is totally empty. It is the breath that flows thorough, sings and dances. To be empty is not emptiness." Let's fill this flute with air and make a great music for all. Thank you very much for taking the opportunity to contribute to this critical and vital issue. I wish everyone a pleasant session, and I give the stage to Melda Çele, Executive Director, Global Compact Network Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you Demet Hanım. Çok teşekkürler tekrardan. Rumi'nin sözleri de kalbimizi, içimizi ısıttı. Soğuk İstanbul gününde. Çok sağ olun. Şimdi panelimize geçmeden önce sizi moderatörümüzle tanıştırmak istiyorum. Christina bizim Global Compact ofisinden çalışma arkadaşımız. Christina uzun süredir yönetişim konusunda Global Compact'te çalışıyor. Sözü sana bırakıyorum Christina. Çok güzel bir panel geçeceğine eminim. İnanılmaz birbirinden uzman panelistlerle çok da şanslı olduğumuzu düşünüyorum bir yandan. Onlarla dinleyebileceğimiz için. Çok sağ ol.
Thank you so much, Melda, for the warm introduction, and to Demet for your inspiring remarks. I think it just set the perfect tone for our session today. Thank you. Please allow me to also extend a warm welcome to you all. I am thrilled to be your moderator for today's panel. My name is Christina Koulias, and I do lead the Global Compact's work on global governance. I'd like to thank Global Compact Network Turkey for this opportunity, and thank our esteemed guests for joining me in this important conversation at this important time. I am joined by Dr. Yılmaz Aguden, who is chair of the Aguden Governance Academy, Mr. Nick Malashev, head of Regulatory Policy Division at the OECD, Dr. Güven Sak, Managing Director of the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey, and Professor Ayden Vur, Chairperson of the Turkish Economic and Social Studies Foundation. You will, of course, hear more from them shortly, but just to sort of add to Demet's comments, I'll just give a bit of background about SDG 16. You may or may not know that peace, justice and strong institutions, or Goal 16, is one of the most broad-ranging and politically sensitive of the SDGs, and was the most widely debated among UN member states. You may or not also be surprised to hear that it's the least understood by business. To give you a sense of some of the targets under Goal 16, they're very broad-ranging and include violence including against children, bribery and corruption, illicit financial flows and organised crime, access to justice, legal identity and rule of law, effective, accountable and transparent institutions, responsive, inclusive and participatory processes, and access to information and protection of fundamental freedoms. And that isn't all of them, but it certainly harks back to some of the themes that Demet also mentioned in her wonderful introduction, that it is all encompassing. And so the purpose of today's session is really to demonstrate just how foundational SDG 16 is across all institutions, public and private, to our people and to our planet. In essence, the targets under Goal 16 reflect what good governance should look like, and our guests will explain why good governance is so important to our everyday lives. The work that we're doing here at the UN Global Compact also supports this effort. In 2019, we launched the Action Platform for Peace, Justice and Strong Institutions, which includes providing a normative framework developed for businesses, by businesses, to help them understand, implement and report on Goal 16. The framework itself will be released around June this year. And we have done some work already, including last year as part of the UN 75th anniversary, we released a statement from business leaders for renewed global cooperation, which was presented to the UN Secretary General. Now, this was an important milestone which highlighted the critical nature of SDG 16 and just how universal and inclusive it is, as we had 1,300 CEOs from around the world, many of them from Turkey, demonstrated their support for the importance of inclusion and multilateralism, particularly as we are facing some of the most challenging crises of our time. The main theme of the framework is to invite businesses to adopt an expanded view of the G, or governance, in ESG, environmental social governance considerations, and how businesses can contribute directly to SDG 16. This includes expanding businesses' understanding of corporate governance, again, much as Demet referenced, to include the business's culture and values, the strategies, the policies, the operations and the relationships, so basically the ethos of the business, and also embracing how businesses can contribute to global governance by engaging with governments and civil society to strengthen institutions, laws and systems, which are so foundational to everything that we do. I'm excited to be speaking with our esteemed panelists today and invite them to now join me in the conversation. We're going to cover two general themes. The first one will be the concept and the spirit of good governance and why it's so foundational to business and society. And the second theme will be about what good governance means in practice across institutions, both public and private, and how we can measure progress and impact. We will then open for a session to you all, so please feel free to send us your questions and we'll try to answer as many as we can, time permitting. So thank you and let's get started. I will start with Dr. Yilmaz Agüden. Yilmaz, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think good governance is and what does it mean for all institutions in the context of Goal 16?
Thank you, Christina. First, let me briefly introduce myself. I'm the chairman of ARGE Consulting, the first Turkish signatory of UN Global Compact. And I had served as the chair of the local network, as well as the global chair of the Local Networks Advisory Group. ARGE Governance Academy, I'm the chairman of the trustees, and it focuses on exactly the topic of today, basically. And first of all, I would like to congratulate and commend both UN Global Compact and in particular the Turkish network for focusing on SDGs on each calendar, a separate calendar day, because they are really very broad and they need focus if we are going to make any progress. So I think that's a very valuable thing. And right now, I'm particularly happy that we are focusing on SDG 16, which is the basis of good governance. First of all, let's try to simplify the subject matter, because as Christina has outlined, it seems to put too many things into the same bag. Why do people form institutions? There are simply two reasons why humans form institutions. One of them is to have risk management, better manage the risks. The second is to utilize the resources more effectively. Whether this institution is family, a tribe, a company, a civil society organization, local government, national government, or even global institutions such as the UN, the only purpose of forming these institutions are for people to better manage risks and better utilize resources. that brings us to good governance. These institutions can serve their purpose better if they have the trust of their stakeholders. So we can basically simplify good governance as trust of stakeholders. Without trust, all of these institutions have increased transaction costs in trying to implement what they are trying to implement. Lack of trust is like having a high friction coefficient for those of you who understand engineering. You conduct the same work, but with a hell of a lot more energy. So you dissipate a lot of energy if there isn't trust, which means that it serves against the purpose of forming the institution in the beginning. Because one of the key reasons for forming institutions was to better utilize the resources. So good governance is such central to our quality of life and sustainability of our future. We can easily say that trust is the essence of good governance and foundation of sustainable development. And this is exactly what SDG 16 is trying to say as well, in a simplified version. If we are going to be successful in managing our institutions, regardless of its size or typology, where it lies in the geography, we need to have the trust of our stakeholders. And that trust can only be gained by good governance, which means transparency, accountability, responsible leadership, consistency in behavior, so that we can manage the expectations as well. And these types of principles are extremely critical for us to have better quality of life and sustainable future. This is why all leaders and actually all stakeholders need to embrace good governance and try to make sure that whichever role they play in the interactions between institutions and so forth, one of the key issues is to identify the elements to bring trust and make sure that we gain that trust. There are lots of measures that different institutions and regulations are trying to accomplish. However, we need to understand that this is a culture. This is a culture that needs to be built from the young ages. And the only way we can achieve our collective goals is to behave properly so that we can mobilize the resources, manage the risks that the world is bringing us, so that we can improve with limited resources the quality of life for the many people, millions of people, billions of people around the world. This is the key for a better future, and we need to embrace good governance in all walks of life, in all types of our organizations.
Excellent.
In a nutshell, this is what I would say about good governance. Good governance is about trust, and trust is extremely difficult to build, very fragile, very easy to undermine. We should not allow any behavior that would undermine the trust, because basically it would be hitting back ourselves with what we do with undermining trust. And this can only be accomplished by transparency, accountability, responsibility, effectiveness of our actions, consistency, and with participation and inclusiveness.
Yeah.
You cannot win the trust of your stakeholders if you do not include them in the decision-making processes.
Exactly.
The modern meaning of human rights and democracy is that people who are influenced by the decisions of various institutions have to have a say in how those decisions are being formed and made.
Yeah.
If we don't come up with systems and mechanisms to do this, trust will be undermined, And that in turn will keep us from having a higher quality of life and a better and sustainable future. Thank you.
Most definitely. Thank you so much for that. It's very, very important scene setting. And, you know, just to distill it, good governance equals trust. It really is about that. And it's, as you say, it's a very hard thing to build and unfortunately easy to dismantle. I would love to hear more from, I'll introduce now Dr. Güvensak. So it's a pleasure to have you with us as well. My question for you is, how do you think transparent institutions helps to progress social development, especially by improving the quality of life for all citizens? It obviously goes to what Yılmaz was mentioning before about this idea of, you know, trust and transparency. So welcome your thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Christina.
Pleasure.
And I'm very happy to be here today. After Yılmaz, you know, he explained all the things that I was about to say. So let me start in this manner. Let me start this way. There is definitely, you know, a positive impact of transparency on development. No question about that. And it is good for improving the quality of life for the whole society. Let me be a little bit more specific. You know, when you look at Turkey, for example, as a country, there are two instances where Turkey has improved its competitiveness in a very swift, in a very important manner. One is in 1980, and the other is early 2000. Those are all reform periods for the Turkish economy. I'm an economist by profession, so let me go say a little bit, something a little bit more about economics. In both cases, in 1980 and early 2000, what happened in Turkey, I think, the Turkish governments at that time has improved the transparency of the public sector. So it was an important portion of the reform efforts in both of those times. You know, so the participants to the economy, the private participants to the economy, has become aware how the government is going to act in different situations. They get a clear view, clear picture of that. And also at the same time, the economic freedoms for the private actors of the economy has enlarged. And I think we had seen the positive impact of that. If you look at the numbers in a longer time frame. For example, if you look at the UNDP's recent Human Development Report, 2020 report, there are two countries that has improved in the last few decades considerably. One is Singapore and the other is Turkey. So I think those reform efforts, just by improving the transparency of the public institutions, when I mean the public institutions, it includes everything, the public sector banks too. So when you improve their transparency, when their actions become more transparent, that's definitely has the potential to increase the quality of life for the whole society if you look at the UNDP's Human Development Report. But when I come to the SDG 16, I think there are more issues there regarding SDG 16, because SDG 16 is about kind of a call for justice, you know, justice for all, you know, for everybody. The diversity, inclusion, gender equality, all the issues that are much more related also, not only related with transparency, I think, much more related with empowerment.
Yes.
So when I look at SDG 16, it's kind of accepting pluralism. So the plurality has to be accepted, first of all. That's what I understand from this diversity inclusion. And that pluralism, I think, also requires democracy to be at work, yes. Which is very much important in achieving the SDG 16 targets. Yeah. So these things are not happening. I mean, transparency by itself does not bring you something, you know, does not lead you move towards some in a positive direction. There is the need for a kind of an infrastructure that is needed in order for the transparency to have a meaning. When it comes to the economy, transparency is important in terms of understanding how the government is going to treat you at the end of the day, but it only becomes, it only makes sense if there are economic freedoms that allows you to do things also. So it's the same thing within this more, how can I say that, in a democracy framework too. In the pluralism framework, it's one thing to, transparently know about the diversities, focus on finding solutions, but also you have to have the power to intervene, to do something. I think that's also an important issue. So let me, stop by saying that transparency is very important in institutions, and Yılmaz, as you know, explained that very well in a kind of a, in the absence of that, there are, important costs, that transaction costs that has to be taken into account. That's an important issue, and that definitely improves the quality of life, but it requires a kind of a framework also, I think, that we need to take into account in terms of the freedoms, economic freedoms or political freedoms also at the same time. So let me stop here.
I love that you made that distinction though, Güven, because it is, as you say, it's like transparency in and of itself is not enough. And this idea of the points that you made are so important around the empowerment of individuals to also be in that civic space is really critical. And it's also, I guess, akin to, one talking about rule of law versus rule by law. You can certainly have a set of laws, but it's the way in which they're enforced and adjudicated that makes all the difference. So it's a really important distinction. Thank you for that. So moving on to Mr. Nick Malyshev. So Nick, the OECD works on open government and digital government initiatives. Can you tell us more about how these initiatives contribute to strengthening good governance and ultimately strengthening the fabric of our society? So welcome your thoughts.
Thank you, Christina. I'll give it my best, but I'd also like to thank the Global Compact Network of Turkey for inviting me and the OECD to share our views with this important meeting. Just to introduce myself, I head up the work at the OECD on better regulation, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that a little bit later on. But maybe turning to the issue of open government and digital government, in my mind, these are really the cornerstones of good governance in the 21st century. If I think about open government, I think this is where public administrations want to be going. Digital government is all about how fast they're going to get there. So if I could start with open government, I mean, in a nutshell, this is really public administration's efforts to be transparent, to be accountable, and to be sort of participatory. I think it's important to recognize that, I think open government is both a mindset as well as a suite of administrative reforms to get there. I mean, the mindset, I think, is important. I think, if you think about public administrations in the past, they were very closed, monolithic, they were sort of beyond the reach of the ordinary citizen. And I think, open government is really trying to break that insularity to really allow governments and society to engage very, very directly. I think, in terms of these sort of administrative reforms, I mean, these are all about freedom of information, participatory processes, just a range of different kinds of reforms that really allow society to interact much more closely with government and in the policymaking process. What kinds of outcomes can this achieve? I mean, if I think about, governments being transparent, kind of going back to Yılmaz's point, this really allows much more effective and efficient policymaking. If governments are really clear about what they're trying to do and how they're going to go about doing it. I think accountability is like, that really makes governments much more responsive to the needs and wishes of society. And this idea sort of about participatory governance, I think one, clearly government administrations can get lots of new ideas. I mean, this is a bit of like crowdsourcing from society for better public policies. And also back to Yılmaz's point, it's very much about trust. I mean, I think the degree to which citizens and civil society can interact in the policymaking process really does set the foundations for more trust in government. I think it's also important to recognize that clearly, I think delivering SDG 16 will be supported by open government. And to Professor Sachs's point, it's not just about transparency. It's really about that participatory process.
Yeah.
Government needs to reach out to society to understand what their needs and concerns are. And likewise, this is a platform for society to really tell government where to go. I think it's also really important to recognize that I think open government really, fundamentally will underpin democracy going forward. And I think that's really, really critical in the current point in time where we are now, where I think in a number of jurisdictions, even ones that have very advanced democratic systems and institutions to support that. Maybe that's sort of the goal of open government, but the reality of it, I think, is a little bit more sobering. We in the OECD, we're all about measuring things, and then we do have quite a bit of data on how OECD countries are kind of delivering on their open government commitments. And it's a bit of a mixed picture. Only about half of OECD countries have an explicit strategy to pursue open government. Clearly, many of those that don't have other reforms that support that, but these are countries that have made an explicit commitment to really do these kinds of things. Moreover than a strategy, I think open government really needs to be underpinned by legal and institutional infrastructure to get it forward. What kinds of laws establish the rights and responsibilities of the public administration vis-a-vis society, and what laws give society, the ability to sort of get into the public policymaking process. Again, only about half OECD countries are really kind of formulating that legal infrastructure. And roughly the same amount have kind of created institutions. I mean, is there, an effective leadership to support open government? Is there an institution somewhere within the center of government dedicated towards pushing this strategy forward? Is this well-resourced, or is the government just kind of sort of waving its arms around saying, oh yes, we're doing all of these things? Again, leadership, capacities, resources are all really key. And finally, our government's monitoring and evaluating these open government reforms. We find that about 90% monitor them, but only 50% have really done any hard-nosed evaluation. And in just my remaining time, I think this kind of gets me into the digital government space. Clearly, this covers many, many things, and I don't really have a chance to talk about that now. But in my mind, I think governments have to use the data that they have on hand to evaluate and monitor programs, including these. Again, how can you use new digital technologies to really start monitoring real-time implementation of government programs? And more importantly, how can you use artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data to really churn through the information that you have on hand to see whether these programs are working? Are they delivering, the objectives to citizens? Again, it's early days. Very few administrations are doing this. I mean, it's a brave new world, and I think there are, incredible things can happen. But again, citizens need to demand, more accountability of their governments to really take the information that they have in hand and use it to make certain that they're achieving, the desires and goals of the public. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. That's great. And I think that, it's interesting that you say that, because again, I think the headline was, this idea that open government is really about ensuring and underpinning democracy, but at its core is really about civic engagement and participation and the idea of servicing the needs of communities and society. And I think if we try and bring it back to the business lens too, increasingly we're seeing businesses being challenged in their own organisations to be able to ensure they have more inclusivity, more participation in their own processes. And at the same time are being challenged by governments and, by customers and also employees to make sure their voices are also heard on really important topics that really matter to society. So I think there's a lot of duality in terms of the role of business in internalising these sorts of concepts, but also ensuring that they are acting responsibly when they're engaging with government and civil society on these issues too. Last but not least, I have a question for Professor Aydin Ur. So, Aidan, why do you think good governance is so important at the local government level, and how these practices could help deliver on the sustainable development goals and leaving no one behind, you know, making sure we have a better society for all?
Çok teşekkür ederim. Daha önceki konuşmacılar büyük ölçüde sürdürülebilirliğin öneminin altını çizmiş oldular. Ben Güven Bey ekonomistim dedi, ben sosyoloğum. O yüzden başka bir perspektiften belki sivil topluma ve yerel yönetime inmeden önce hepimizi şu anda kuşatmış olan bir iklimden, bir düşünce, bir hissiyat ikliminden bahsetmek istiyorum. Sanıyorum şu anda dünya önemli bir krizler, iç içe geçmiş krizler içinde. Bunlardan bir tanesini gündeliğimizde yaşıyoruz, koronavirüs krizi. Ama onun hemen arkasında, onun besleyici unsurlarından bir tanesi olarak küresellik var tabii. Ya küresel sistemde işte iktisatçıların çok yakından takip ettiği gibi tedarik zincirleri allak bullak oldu, ekonomilerin verimlilikleri aşağı düştü, bir sürü şirket eski olduğu noktadan geriye kaldı ve bir sürüsünün de yavaş yavaş belli boydakilerin kaybolma ihtimali gözüküyor. Bu bir tanesi korona. Bir diğeri tabii iklim krizi. Ondan çok daha önemli olduğunu düşündüğüm. Aşısı da öyle bulunduğu zaman 6 ayda meseleyi halledecek bir şey olmayan bir şey. Bu iklim krizi. Üçüncüsü pek sözü edilmiyor ama hissediliyor. O da ileri demokrasilerde bile hissediliyor. Bir temsili demokrasi krizi yaşanıyor. Yani 3 kriz bir arada. En basiti bunların mikroplar, virüslerle ilgili olanı. Sonra bütün yaşam alanlarımız, bütün sistem, ekolojik sistemle ilgili olanı ve bütün bunların için çare bulması gereken siyasal rejimin şimdiye kadar ehven-i şer olarak kabul edilen formunun dahi teklemeye başlamış olması. Aslında bahsedilmesi gereken galiba biz büyük tırnak içinde medeniyet krizi içindeyiz. O medeniyet krizi sanıyorum bir güvensizliği de beraberinde getiriyor. O güvensizliği beraberinde getirmesi aslında adaletle de ilgili sanıyorum. Yani şeffaflık, hesap verebilirlik bunların hepsi var ama adalet. Aslında sürdürülebilirlik çıkışından itibaren böyle bir adalet fikrini içeriyor. Çünkü en kaba tarifiyle daha önce yapıldı tarifler ama izin verirseniz ben de küçücük bir şey yapayım. Yani gelecek kuşakların gereksinmelerinin karşılanması bir sınır getirmeden günümüz insanların gereksinmelerini karşılayacak biçimde doğal kaynakların kullanılması diye başlamış olan bir yaklaşım bu. Ama burada bahsedilen hikaye aslında kuşaklar arası adalet. Ama kuşaklar arası adaletin hemen arkasından gelen yaşayan insanlar arasındaki adalet kategorisi de devreye giriyor. O yüzden de bu global goals'un, yani küresel hedeflerin hepsinin aslında gelip bağlandığı yer 16. SKA. Yani orada peace var. O peace'in olabilmesi için demin söylendiği gibi pluralizmin kabul edilmesi lazım. Ötekileştirmeden herkesin aynı insani değerde olduğunun kabullenilmesi lazım. Justice dediğimizde sanıyorum mahkeme justice'i değil burada. Yani equity anlamında bir justice. Tabii mahkemelerde bu equity'nin sağlanmasının bir mekanizması. Ama esas mesele o hakça bir toplum kurabilme hikayesi. Hakça bir toplum olabilmesine dair baktığınız zaman bu korona bize iyi bir örnek veriyor. Demin sözü edildi güven meselesi, şeffaflık meselesi. Bu korona ile mücadelede en başarılı olanlar dikkat edilirse Yeni Zelanda mesela bir örnek. kuzeydeki bazı ülkeler, mesela Danimarka bir başka örnek. Çünkü bunların geçmişinde vatandaşlarının güvenini sağlamışlık var. Müthiş bir kendi hükümetlerinin şeffaf olduğu, kendileriyle paylaştıkları bilgilerin güvenilir olduğuna dair yurttaşlarda köklü bir inanç var. O köklü inancın üzerine siz mücadelenizi çok daha rahatlıkla oturtabiliyorsunuz. Çok daha büyük bir herkesin rızasıyla katılımını mümkün kılıyorsunuz. O bakımdan ben güvenin ve adaletin altını tekrar çizmek istiyorum. Diğer konuşmacılar gibi. Bir başka husus.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for your remarks. I think that, you know, even if we look at it through this, the idea is it's getting back to the local aspect really is at its core is that social contract. This idea that, you know, when you say we're going through a civilization crisis, a lot of the discussion that we're hearing lately is around the erosion of trust across all institutions, this idea that these crises are stress testing us, whether it's the climate crisis, whether it's COVID, and this idea of, as you say, justice in the sense of equity. You know, we don't want to be leaving anyone behind. And unfortunately, these sorts of crises really amplify where the injustices lie. And, you know, I think that a lot of in the business community, but also publicly, there is this reflection on what does the new social contract look like. A conversation for another day, but certainly this goal 16 is at the core of achieving that. So it's a very interesting topic that you've raised. Thank you. Thank you for that. So we're going into the second round, I guess, of questions.
İsterseniz küçücük de bir şey daha eklemek isterim. Yani yerel yönetim bunun neresinde diye konuşulduğunda yerel yönetim en azından Türkiye'ye baktığınız zaman nüfusun çok büyük çoğunluğunun çok kısa bir sürede kırsaldan kente geldiğini ve bütün bu demin söylemiş olduğum krizlerin hepsinin de ete kemiğe esasen değdiği yerin kent ve o kentin yönetimi olduğunun altını çizmek isterim. Bütün dünyada böyle, Türkiye'de giderek daha da böyle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we forget, we talk a lot about international agendas and national plans, but it's the impact is really at that local municipality, the municipal level that we really can't take for granted. So it's an important point that you've flagged there. So we have about 20 minutes remaining of our discussion, and I feel like I could talk to you all day. I'd love to make sure I invite also our listeners to share their questions as we're speaking, because we will try and see if we can have an extra 5 or so minutes to answer those questions if possible. I'll mix the order up a little bit this time, and I'll go back to Nick. So Nick, you mentioned earlier that you're working on the sort of the regulatory landscape. I'd love to hear from you about how you feel regulations have an important role in our everyday life, and how do you think having robust regulatory processes and frameworks really can contribute to achieving peaceful, just and inclusive societies?
Thanks, Christine. I feel like I'm slightly more on turf that I understand well. I think for me, I think it's safe to say that I think regulation is probably the most powerful instrument that governments hold. If you think about fiscal interventions, you know, for the most heavy-handed state, it might be 50%. I think it's safe to say that regulation conveys costs and benefits 2 or 3 times more than that. So getting regulatory frameworks right is really important. And there's basically, you know, kind of a governance around how governments regulate. And we usually in the OECD refer to this as regulatory governance. And you can think about it almost in the same terms as with open government, in terms of, you know, are they transparent? Are they participatory? And are they accountable? Yeah. And I kind of put this into 3 issues in the regulatory realm. You know, are they transparent? You know, regulations clearly, you know, convey costs and benefits. They sometimes create winners and losers. And it's important that governments are fair and transparent in terms of how they express to society, how they're making these decisions. That, you know, can they make the case that there's a net benefit to society in terms of their regulatory intervention? This is usually done through impact assessment systems where governments say, you know, these are the benefits that have been accruing. And these, unfortunately, are the costs, and we're trying to minimize those costs, and they will accrue to certain parts of society, but overall, the community will be better off through this intervention. So they have to be transparent and fair.
Yeah.
They have to be participatory. They have to be able to go to the public with a draft law or a draft regulation and say, we want to talk about this with you. We understand that there might be certain people who are harmed by this. We want to hear your views. We want to reassure you that we're trying to do this in a way that is proportionate, but ultimately is in the interest of society and not just the interest of your small group. There's been quite a bit of cognitive research that shows that if you do this, people who are disenfranchised by regulatory decisions are more likely to accept them if they feel that they've been part of the conversation. So it's not just lip service. This really does result in more trust in regulatory decisions. And finally, I think governments have to be accountable by evaluating whether public policy interventions, whether regulations are working, they're working in the interest of society. And they do that through evaluation and through review. So that's kind of this regulatory governance framework that we talk about. But I also want to touch on one other thing. I mean, when you think about regulation, you usually just think about interventions that are made by governments within their own jurisdiction. But I think the thorniest problems of the day really involve international cooperation in the regulatory realm. You know, and if I think about COVID, you know, COVID is a global pandemic and it's a global crisis. And the only way that we're basically gonna effectively manage it is through international cooperation. It's disheartening to see that the trends in this direction have been pretty weak. There's been a lot of unilateralism, particularly in the early part of the pandemic around the procurement of essential goods. And now in the current day with the procurement of vaccines. I mean, I think it was quite heartening to see the international scientific community come together really quickly, share the DNA sequence to the virus very quickly, historically develop these vaccines. But again, I think governments need to work much more carefully together in order to address, you know, the urgent needs of solving this global health and economic crisis. And I think if we think about, you know, the collective response to the COVID pandemic, I think it sheds light on the management of the global commons. I mean, recent history has given us many, many challenges, you know, climate change, inequality from globalization, aging populations, you know, and now this problem of disinformation. All of these problems will only be solved through collective global action. We have to have linked up solutions across governments, across jurisdictions to address this, because the chance for regulatory arbitrage, the chance for kind of the race to the bottom are just too great. So again, you know, I think the COVID test is a little bit of, the COVID pandemic is a little bit of a litmus test. And I think governments obviously need to work much more carefully and much more closely together to solve these even bigger crises going forward. So thank you for your attention.
Right. No, thank you so much for that, Nick. I think the underpinning message there is that, you know, this is a call for us to have international comity and cooperation. And I think that, you know, we are, you know, regulation will only go so far. Yes, I mean, it's an important framework, important foundation, but unless the mindsets are changed, the leadership is there, the political will is there, all those things really do matter. I think also your comments that you made is a nice lead on to Güven's next question. I feel like Nick also touched on a few themes there as well, Güven. So people are stealing your message before you get there, but I think you provide some wonderful additional insights. Amazing. So this question is around the idea that representative, inclusive and participatory decision-making are critical to good governance. I think I feel like we've established that through this discussion. How do you think these elements can be incorporated into strengthening our institutions, both private and public? I think they're equally important in order for us to better serve customers, employees and communities. How do we do that? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, yes. Nick mentioned again some of the things that I would like to mention. But let me start by the situation that we are in. I share the view that, you know, this COVID-19, first of all, has made it possible for all of us to cooperate more. I think it's now forcing us to talk more, because it's obvious that there is no way out individually out of this thing. I mean, this is true for the countries, this is true for the humanity, this is true for all of us. So I think this has changed a kind of our mindsets regarding the problems, regarding how we are approaching our solutions. I think in that manner, this inclusiveness, participatory processes have become more important, if you ask me, in this new environment. You know, you have to connect more, you have to talk more in order to convince more people, you know, to act together to deal with this problem. It also, I think, helps us, the COVID-19 process. It pushes forward the digital transformation very quickly. And I think it is also empowering the individuals, to all of us, you know, by creating new instruments. Because in the past, Yılmaz has mentioned that in his first question, the issue that, you know, the human beings are working together in groups. We come together, we have learned that, you know, we need to do some respacing, introduce social distancing into our endeavors. It's not that easy to do in this new environment, because in the past, in order to put some inclusiveness at some participatory processes, you know, what we do in Turkey at TEPAV, we bring people to great halls like the American town hall meetings. I think we first introduced that into Turkey in 2012. You know, bring all of them together and start a discussion, just to you both give them the sense that, you know, their views making sense, and also for the other side, for the company or for the government agency or for the parliament who is bringing them together, it also helps that institution to get more views and useful ideas about what the people are thinking about. But now with COVID-19, with digital transformation, I think there are now new ways also to communicate too at the same time. I was looking at the numbers, for example, in October, I think the daily active users of Reddit, you know, this social media platform for discussions, etc., it has increased around 45%. So more people are, you know, looking for information, starting new platforms, discussing issues. And I think this growing importance or growing numbers of Clubhouse also might be related with that too. It may turn into, you know, a new mechanism for participatory or deliberative discussion methods. I think are also in a process of transformation. So this, together with this mindset shift, I think this fact that, you know, these new technologies are enabling us to talk more, to connect more and more easily, you know, it's less costly. Although we are not very much used to this social distancing issues, but now it is possible for all of us to come together with, you know, different people all around the globe by sitting in our room. I think this is also an important improvement to help us to have more of these deliberative processes, I think. But of course, let me also underline the negative side of it too. That's where I think this digital divide, technology divide issues are becoming much more important now, that we need to take into account. And there, let me add one more thing. I think this transparency is important for also within the societies. It's important for knowledge diffusion, which is important for technological change and the diffusion of new technologies, new ideas. So I think, you know, it is very much important. Transparency is important there for the knowledge diffusion impact, which is important for all our societies to improve our ways of life. But I think this rising global inequalities, this digital divide issues are also very much important. I'm thinking in terms of, for example, nowadays there is this huge discussion about green transformation in the West, basically.
Yes.
And the major argument there is, oh, this green transformation, low carbon technologies to be applied to all the sectors. We already knew about these things, but as there is this huge fixed capital requirement that needs to achieve that transformation, that transition. Now that in the West, the interest rates are negative so low, we can now achieve that and, boost the economies to get out of the COVID-19 depressions, much more easily. But this also means, because on the other side of the aisle, developing countries are not in the same same place, on this side of the world, we have highly indebted companies, troubled banking systems, high CDS, high risk premiums for borrowing. And that makes, this has the potential, I think, to kind of, lead to deeper trenches, more digital divide, more technology divide between developing and developed countries. And I think that's an issue that we also need to focus on nowadays, I think.
Absolutely.
Start discussing at least.
Absolutely.
Green Deal and green transformation is good by itself. It has all the good connotations, but it has the potential, I think, to lead to a deeper divide between developing and developed countries at the same time.
Absolutely.
So let me stop here.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I think, the headline as well is the reality of, to make things participatory, this idea of the public, I think of the public dialogue, and it again relates both to public institutions and private institutions. We're asking businesses to think more broadly about how they're engaging with their stakeholders, whether it's their employees, their customers, or even the communities, whether it's Indigenous communities or disenfranchised communities. And I think that idea of participation is so important. And as you say, technology, I think, also pushes that to some extent, notwithstanding all of the equity issues, because they are significant. But this idea that, it brings those folks together closer. And so businesses and government are more compelled to have to respond, which is the power of technology. I'm mindful that we have about 5 or so minutes left, and we have 2 more questions, and then I'll open it up. So I don't obviously want to take too much time talking more, but just to say to Aiden, just to want to hear from you, if you can, in a few minutes, because I also want to make sure Yilmaz has an opportunity to speak. This idea of good governance for civil society organisations, what role do you think that civil society can help play in making sure that public and private institutions are being held more accountable, both locally and globally? I'd just love to hear your thoughts on the role of civil society organisations.
Tabii efendim. Yani aslında bütün bunlar bir niyetten başlıyor. Yönetimin hesap verilebilirlik ilkesini benimsemesi. Onun üzerine de açıklık ve şeffaflık uygulamasını getirmesi ve katılıma kapısını açması. Katılımı kapısını açtığınız zaman 3 husus devreye girmek zorunda. Bir tanesi bilgilendirme, bir tanesi istişare, bir diğeri de aktif katılım. Bunlar olduğu zaman sonuç alınabiliyor. Sivil toplum dediğiniz aslında yurttaşların kendi arayışları için yönetişim unsuru içinde yer almaya çalışmalarının yeri. Baktığınız zaman biz TESEV'de mesela demin dijitalleşme ve dijital yeni enstrümanlardan bahsettik. Bunlardan bir tanesi mesela altını çizmek istediğim bizim bir çalışmamız var TESEV'de. O da daha demokratik bir yerel yönetim için sivil toplumu güçlendirme projesi. Bunun arkasında bir dijital enstrüman var. O dijital enstrüman bir regülasyonlarla, demin Nek'in sözüne ettiği, bizim yerel yönetimlerimize 5 yıllık stratejik plan hazırlamayı ve yıllık faaliyet raporları çıkarmayı zorunlu kılıyor. Ama bu böyle kendi içinde kapalı bir devre olarak gittiği sürece o güven duygusu oturamıyor. Onun için katılımı mümkün kılacak bir dijital araç geliştirmek lazımdı. Biz bütün belediyelerin verilerini, kendileri de tam hakim olmayan verileri bir ortak enstrümanın havuzuna bağlamış olduk. İsteyen belediye, şu anda sayıları 20'yi geçti bizimle birlikte çalışan, bu stratejik planına dair hangi işi, hangi paraya, hangi süre içinde yapacaklarını o enstrüman üzerinde ortaya koyuyorlar. Sivil toplum kuruluşları veya vatandaşlar da onları izliyor. Hangi iş, hangi aşamada ne masraf yapıldı, kendisi nasıl katkı yapabilir konusunda da o enstrümanı kullanarak destek verebiliyor. Dolayısıyla bilgilendirme olması mümkün oluyor, istişare yapılabilmesi ve aktif katılım için eğer kapılar açıksa da yol kurulmuş oluyor. Yani aslında bu veri ekosisteminin sürdürülebilir kentler için güçlendirilmesi son derece önemli. Aynısı herhalde merkezi hükümetler için de söz konusu ama yerelde bu çok daha insanların kendilerinin yöneten sisteme güvenini sağlamış oluyor. Yani dijitalizasyon o anlamda ekosistemin güçlendirilmesi için, data ekosisteminin güçlendirilmesi için çok önemli bir enstrüman noktasına geliyor. Tabii digital divide'ın içinde taşıdığı eksiklikler, olumsuzlukları da göz önünde bulundurmak şartıyla.
Of course. No, that's a great insight. And I think just to say that what's interesting about this as well is that we cannot underestimate the importance of civil society voice, even for businesses. It helps them to understand what some of the issues are on the ground as well from their own operating environment, but also to hear civil society's voice in their own operations as well as businesses and really heed what is going on the ground and making sure that they are being respectful of human rights and other such issues as well. So the power of civil society is incredibly important. Last, again, by no means least, Yılmaz, I'd love to hear from you. And we have one question that we will have time to ask after this as well. But in terms of looking at measurement, I know that the Aguden Governance Academy works on developing tools and to measure performance on good governance practices, both for public and private institutions. Can you tell us more about those tools and how they seek to improve good governance, and how you think reporting is an important driver?
I would be happy to. First of all, I would like to say, tie it to Demet Hanım's opening speech. She had mentioned about Leonardo da Vinci type leadership. I think the business world needs a hell of a lot more new Renaissance thinking, new enlightened leadership. And I'm in a way optimist in this area because it seems like the stars are aligned as well. We are entering into the Aquarius age, and Aquarius age is the age of enlightened leadership. I hope we will have more of those. As you had suggested, 1,300 CEOs have signed a document in this on that way. I'm one of those 1,300 with my firm, and we spend 1 day a week for nonprofit work every week for 30 years. And the Academy is developing business type of methodology for social development in this area through this kind of work as well. I'll give you two examples. One of them is about local governments, just like the Aydın Bey had mentioned. It is extremely important because that's where the democracy gets built. That's where the rubber meets the road. And let's continue with the example that Aydın Bey has given. Right now, we have a law because of the EU events and so forth as well, that strategic plans for local governments have to be done participative fashion. One of the things that we have measured is what is the quality of participation from publicly open sources. And how can you do this? first of all, are the municipalities sharing what kind of process they have taken to involve participation? Is it only a few people that they know? Is it more inclusive? Whatever. What kind of sampling is there? What kind of tools are being utilized? Is it only surveys or face-to-face meetings and so forth? And then are they providing this information publicly so that those who feel they are not involved could raise their hands? Then are they sharing what the proposals came from this process in a general public? If they are not sharing it, then people's motivation for participation is not increasing. I mean, they may not accept all the proposals, but what is being raised has to be shared publicly. Then, which of these options have been accepted and became part of the strategic plan, which have not, and why? If you are explaining these, then the motivation for participation and the trust for that process is very high, despite the fact that some of your proposals may not have played a role there. So there's a lot more information like this. Yeah. And the website of the Academy, argidenacademy.org, has available, because this is a public good, for local governments. Similarly, we have done a similar research for global development of SDGs and sustainability issues for the global sustainability leader companies. Top 200 some companies, looking at their publicly available information, how are they conducting the governance of their sustainability efforts? Yes. Are they reporting on only what they do well? Or do they have a process for stakeholder engagement? And again, are they sharing the issues that have been raised in the stakeholder engagement? And how are they addressing it? Are they providing targets? Are they just reporting the past performance? Or targets? If you are reporting targets, it means that your CEO is online, your board is online, and there are resources around it. If you're just reporting what you are doing nice, you may be doing it for advertising type of greenwashing, bluewashing type of. Yes, yes. So just this question even improves the quality of governance. Then are we aligning incentives with the world we want? If these companies are saying these sustainability measures are important for us, whatever they have picked it, then is there any linkage with the executive compensation? Yes. If not, they are the first things to ignore when lifetime becomes difficult. Yes. So asking these types of questions, and for example, does your board have people with experience in sustainability? If not, how can you question the proposals that are brought to you if you don't have that lens in the most important element of decision making? Yeah. So these types of questions are actually helping peer learning. And what we are seeing is that among these 200 global sustainability leaders, there are very good examples who can be shared with others so that global peer learning can speed up. Yeah. This is true for local governments, this is true for corporations, and the enlightened leadership yes. needs to look at good examples from others around the world and try to incorporate them into their own decision-making, into their processes and so forth, so that the trust of their stakeholders can be increased. So there are two lines that the corporate leaders need to focus on. One of them is through this kind of a process, increasing trust into their own organizations, which is definitely number one. But at the same time, they are so important in terms of making allocations about resources globally. So their involvement in global decision-making and allocating time and effort into these types of initiatives, such as business for peace, business for rule of law, and so forth type of initiatives, is extremely important, because that brings the quality of participation to a higher level. And that also brings more resources into building trust in the community, not only for your own institution, but also with the government, local government, national government, international organizations, and corporations and NGOs all together. So I hope that the alignment of the stars will help us better improve our SDG 16. And once again, I wish to congratulate everybody for the Good Governance Day and this particular effort to focus our discussions on good governance this day. I hope we will be able to repeat it more and more with better and better examples, because that's what we need as the world, and each individual and each institution that the individuals have built. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yılmaz. I was going to say there was actually a very similar question that was asked from the audience about how can business report on Goal 16 through their sustainability reporting, and but I just think
one of the things that our research has demonstrated is SDG 16 is the least focused SDG of the 17 by the business world.
Absolutely.
However, we are doing it this sustainability governance scorecard every year. Last year's report from previous year's report, there was very good increase. It was 14% involved with it in this strategy. Now it's 24%. I would like to remind you, these are the global leaders. So even the leaders, less than a quarter is embracing SDG 16 in any minor way. However, there's an increase and we need to move much faster and much further individually and globally to have a better world.
Fantastic. That is such an interesting statistic, not because it's good, because it's not, but just to say there's room for improvement, and we're seeing the trend.
Exactly.
Very good. And I love that, you know, we wouldn't have been having this conversation the way that we have 3 years ago. Like, this is, you know, the sad, I always call it a tragic opportunity. The fact that we've had all of these crises come to us really makes us reflect and take stock on how the world is really operating. Is it working? Is it not working? And I think that, you know, all of the wonderful observations that all of our very esteemed panelists have made today have really shed some important light on the importance of Goal 16. And Yılmaz, at the end, I really think that you brought it all home for us in terms of how, you know, this idea that this is something that, you know, enlightened leaders need to really pay more attention to. This is the age of enlightened leadership, of revitalizing our social contract, both in the public space, but also in the private space, that our business leaders do have an important role to play to not only internalize the tenets of Goal 16 within their own organizations, but as you rightly point out as well, is play an active role in the global governance landscape as well. There is such a powerful impact that responsible businesses can have. So I thank you. I know that there aren't that many, I don't see any other questions coming through. There was just that one, and I thought it was a nice one to end with. But just to say, I'm so grateful for your contributions. It was a privilege to speak to you all. I could have spoken to you for so much more time. It's been a pleasure and an honor. And thank you to Global Compact Network Turkey for this opportunity as well. And back to you, Melda. Thank you.
Çok teşekkürler. Harika bir paneldi. Panelistlerimize de çok teşekkür ediyorum. İyi yönetişim nedir? Bizim hayat için anlamı nedir? Konuştuk. Bireyler, kurumlar, toplum açısından iyi yönetişim ne anlama geliyor? Biraz onu tartıştık. İyi yönetişimin olmazsa olmazlarının ve tüm paydaşlara düşen sorumlulukları ve biraz da yapabileceklerimizden de bahsettik. Benim bu panelden çıkardığım mesaj, 2030 yılında SKA'lara ulaşmak istiyorsak kapsayıcı politikalar geliştirmek ve küresel işbirlikleri yapmalıyız. Bu politikaların ve işbirliklerinin başarılı olması için de şeffaflık, katılımcılık ve güven ortamının sağlanması gerekiyor. Tabii en son Yılmaz Bey'in bahsettiği raporlama ve gelişimin takibi konusu da önemli. Gelişimin takibini yapmak ve birbirinden öğrenmenin hızını arttırmak için ölçmeli, gelişimi ölçmeli ve raporlama yapmalıyız diye düşünüyorum ben de. Son teşekkürümü Kristina'ya vermek istiyorum. Çok ilham verici bir paneldi Kristina. Elle tutulmayan ve kimi zaman anlaşılması zor olan bu konuyu senin moderasyonun ve panelistlerimizin değerli katkılarıyla somutlaştırdık. Bir tane soru gördüm ben. Eğer uygunsa sizler için o soruyu almak isterim. O da şirketlerin sürdürülebilirlik raporlarında 16. SKA'ya dair neler var? Bu konuyla ilgili hiç aksiyon alanlar var mı diye sorulmuş. Bu soruya cevap vermek isteyen panelistimiz var mı? İlk önce ona şey yapayım.
Arzu ederseniz ben bir iki tane söyleyebilirim.
Lütfen Yılmaz Bey.
Mesela şirketlerin sorumluluğu olmamasına rağmen göçmenlerin kuruma kazandırılması için eğitim programları düzenleyen, bunun istatistiklerini takip eden kuruluşlarımız var. Hatta bunlardan bir tanesi de Global Compact Türkiye'nin bir önceki başkanının CEO'luk yaptığı kurum. Dolayısıyla bu kapsayıcı olmayı, çevresinin sorunlarına çözüm üretme bakış açısını getirmek çok kritik. Bir tane daha örnek vereyim. Bu da bir tekstil şirketinden. Biliyorsunuz su yaşam için son derece önemli bir konu. Ve birçok şirket artık su kullanımını azaltmak için ciddi çaba gösteriyor. Kendi kurumları içerisinde. Fakat bu bahsedeceğim şirket sadece kendi kurumundaki su kullanımını iyileştirmek değil, fabrikalarının bulunduğu havzalardaki su kullanımını iyileştirmek için o suyu kullanan tarım işçileri, tarla sahipleri, o bölgede yaşayan insanlara da daha etkili su kullanımı için eğitim programı getiriyor. Bunu sadece su için görmemek lazım. Bu aynı zamanda bir yönetişim meselesi. Çünkü kendi sorumluluğu o havzayı korumak değil, ama bu enlightened leadership dediğimiz, yani gelişmiş ve daha bütünsel, entegre bakan kurumlar aslında kendi fabrikasındaki su kullanımını azaltmaktan çok daha büyük bir etkiyi o camiaya, o topluluğa verebilir hale geliyor. Çok basit eğitimlerle, çok basit ölçüm mekanizmalarına küçük yatırımlar yapmakla. Kendi fabrikasında yapacağından daha büyük bir zenginlik kazandırabiliyor. Ki bu sonunda da kendisine de faydası var. Çünkü eğer o bölgede kuraklık olursa o fabrikanın taşınması lazım. Oradan bol miktarda göç olacak. Bunun getireceği maliyet, oradaki havzanın daha iyi kullanılması için bilgi paylaşımı ve ölçmenin getirilmesi için yapılacak yatırımınla karşılaştırılamayacak kadar yüksek. Bu nedenle bu enlightened leadership dediğimiz, sorumlu liderlik dediğimiz kavram aslında kazan-kazan ilişkisi getiriyor. Ne kadar bütünsel düşünürsen, çevresini düşünmeyenin çevresi kalmıyor. İçinde dünya olmayan dünya içinde yaşayamıyor. Dolayısıyla dünyayı bütünsel düşünebilmek, çevresiyle ne fayda sağlayabilirim ve oranın yaşanılabilirliğini nasıl iyileştiririm demek, aslında şirketlerin risklerini daha iyi yönetmek kadar daha da fazla değer yaratmalarına da yardımcı oluyor. Ümit ediyorum ki bu anlayış ve liderlik felsefesi bahsettiğimiz tipteki örneklerin çoğalmasıyla dünyada çok daha yaygınlaşacak ve böylelikle de daha iyi bir dünyaya ulaşacağız.
Çok teşekkürler Yılmaz Bey. Şu an arkadaşlarım beni uyarıyorlar, vaktimiz azalıyor diye. Soruları alıyoruz ve panelistlerimize ileteceğiz. Cevapları da sizlerle paylaşacağız. Meeting minutlar yayınlanacak mı diye sormuşsunuz. Bütün bunun kaydı yapılıyor şu an webinarımızın ve YouTube'dan da yayınlanacak önümüzdeki dönemde. Oradan takip edebilirsiniz. Şimdi izninizle son sözü BM Türkiye Muhkim Koordinatörü Alvaro Rodriguez'e vermek istiyorum. Alvaro.
Good, thank you. Thank you very much, Melda. Teşekkürler to everyone. This has really been very wonderful seminar, and I'm really appreciative of having had the opportunity to listen to Christina and all of our distinguished panelists. I actually had a prepared statement. I will not deliver it given the time and in fact, given the richness of the discussion. But I just wanted to highlight a few points that are at least significant for me in terms of the discussion, and that I think would provide some guidance in terms of some of the work that we can continue to carry out, not only within the different chapters of the Global Compact, but of course, even as UN country teams, working with different development stakeholders, including the private sector moving forward. But maybe as a general introduction, I would just say that the SDG goals, you know, the 17 goals, 169 targets, and about 240 indicators, however useful they are, they only capture certain proxies of the sorts of things that we want in our societies and what we want in our global community of nations. And the actual SDG declaration is valuable and in a sense embodies many of the concepts that have been introduced by the panelists. And it's true, sometimes we focus too much on the goals, targets, and indicators, but the declaration itself is a wonderful example of what we can do when globally we put our heads together to think about issues. And I guess related to that, and this would be my next point, is that even before COVID, and as highlighted by the panelists, we've been living maybe a couple of decades of what I often call the age of anxiety when I talk to students. It sounds rather dramatic, but the point I try to make with them when I discuss the last couple of decades in the way the world has evolved and what has happened with COVID is that COVID, in a sense, has been a health management crisis, but it has amplified and magnified problems that were already there before. And as Aiden mentioned, climate change is a much more serious problem. The data is clear. We've known it for much longer. It's just a pity that we haven't addressed it with the urgency of COVID. Of course, with COVID's 2.5 million deaths approximately, it's hard to compete with that. But climate change has got the potential to do much more damage than even COVID. So the point is that we live at a time of great anxiety. And when I talk to young people in particular, which are a very important audience for us in the UN, we notice that COVID has just amplified and magnified problems that were already there. And a lot of it has to do, of course, with governance and with SDG 16. But where I think we've already learned from the early days of conceptualization of SDG 16 is the role of other actors, and particularly the private sector. And in Turkey, this is so incredibly obvious that without the private sector, despite all of the good intentions of government to even civil society, we will not move forward either on goal 16 or many others as well. So that is extraordinarily important, and how we actually come around together to deliver a collective action on specific priorities is where I think we really struggle. And I think part of the problem has to do with this very interesting discussion that everybody referred to on participation, on voice, on the challenge of illiberal democracies, where just because you elect somebody, it doesn't mean that they will follow liberal policies, follow liberalism. And I don't mean it in an economic sense. I mean it in a political economy sense. We are really challenged there. And illiberal democracy, I think, is one of the features that has reared its head over the last couple of decades around the world. And we see its manifestations in populism and many other ways that have been very noticeable the last few years in particular. So we have a real challenge there is how do we capture participation of people both internally within organizations, but also between people in different organizations and sectors of society. And that we're not so good at. Even in the United Nations, we are, of course, a member state organization of governments with an interest to work with many others that are non-governmental. But we struggle with that. And I think the Global Compact is an example of an early venture into this many years ago, but so much more is needed. But maybe a couple of final points as well that we see as challenges, but also opportunities. One of them is what has already been raised is the role of technology, digital governance, and the whole issue of how we regulate the sector to be able, if we can call it a sector, to manage disinformation. And of course, this has been particularly prominent during COVID, but of course, it was a problem that was there before and will accompany us into the future. The more we engage in a dialogue to enhance people's voices and communities' voices, the more we enhance participation, paradoxically, we also enhance disinformation. but we also enhance the tools that enable us to corroborate, from fact check to many other measures. And I think that there's a real appetite among all sectors of society that have a responsibility to manage what is out there in the open domain, whether it's government or UN or private sector in terms of their own policies, that more can be done. And then finally, the topic of regulation, which again is a fascinating topic, because we've realized that as open as we want to be, and as very rightly put by Nick, there are pros and cons. There are many pros to regulation, but often they're not well understood. And people feel that regulation is some form of a type of control. And well, it may be in the specific sense of the words used, but if the intention and if the purpose is to enhance the benefits vis-a-vis the costs, that proper awareness raising on all of this is so essential. And with regards to the private sector itself and within Goal 16, this would be particularly relevant because we still have many communities around the world that look at the private sector with a lot of skepticism, that define the private sector as looking only after its bottom line and nothing else. And of course, times have changed from that kind of very almost Machiavellian private sector caricature that often exists out there. Not that it doesn't happen, it does happen, but it doesn't mean that that is the general norm. So I would end there because these are all topics that, and many others that I think we will take on here. We are delighted as UN Turkey to partner with the Global Compact Chapter of Turkey. And if I guess the right way for me to conclude before handing over to Melda is to really thank you, Christina, and all of our panelists, Guven and Dr. Yilmaz, Nick, and Aydin, for really what has been a wonderful afternoon. I hope the audience has enjoyed it, and we look forward to further interactions on this. So thank you very much. Teşekkürler and güle güle.
Teşekkürler Alvaro. Çok çok güzel bir sunumdu. Sunumunun içerisinde panel sırasında gelen birkaç soruya da cevap vermiş oldun. Çok teşekkür ederiz. Zamanınızı daha fazla almadan tam zamanda bitiren bir webinar oldu. Çok teşekkür ederim bütün katılımcılara bizi dinlediğiniz için. Christina, Yılmaz Bey, Alvaro, Nick, Güven Bey, Aydın Bey tekrardan çok sağ olun. En yakın zamanda görüşmek üzere. Tercümanlarımıza da buradan ufak bir teşekkür verelim. 1,5 saattir bizlerin tercümesini yapıyorlar. Çok sağ olun, iyi günler, iyi akşamlar dilerim.